Hey, what's going on, guys? So this part is going to be the Express backend. Initially, I wanted to combine the entire video with the Stripe, the Express backend, and then the React app. But seeing that this video was going to end up being 3 hours long, I knew a lot of people wouldn't be happy with that. So what I decided to do was to decide to separate the introduction with Stripe away from the actual Express backend, because a lot of the stuff that we're going to be doing in the Express backend, it's going to be nothing to do with Stripe really. We don't really get to the Stripe part until like the very end. So it doesn't really make sense to just have you guys sit through everything and then, wait for the Stripe part. So instead, I know I promised you guys a full stack tutorial on how to set up authorization, authentication. So here it is. If you guys want to learn how to integrate the app with Stripe, watch the other part of the video. It will teach you everything you need to know on how to create a payment, a subscription, and etc. Alright guys, so we're going to set up our project right now. So we're going to worry about the backend first. So the backend, we're going to use Express. We're going to use, I think we're going to probably use Mongodb just to make things simple. I did intentionally want to use type RM with MySQL, but I feel like, I think it'd be easier with MongoDB, and I don't want to, have you guys worry so much about a bunch of different things. Type RM isn't that hard, but we're just going to use MongoDB just to, make things simple. We're going to go ahead and just make a directory. So let's do mkdir. And let's go ahead and do Stripe payment tutorial. And we'll cd into here. Now this is going to be a single directory that's going to have two directories, the front and the back end. All of the code will be in one repository, so you guys can check it out. I'm going to go ahead and create a new directory, call this Stripe backend. And you can also create the project up manually if you want, but we're going to use the terminal for that. Okay, so I'm going to just initialize the folder, and I'm going to install Express because we're using Express. Let's see, what else do I need to install? We're going to need to install Express sessions because we're going to need to persist the user. That's how we're going to make sure that they don't have to log in over and over and over again. We're going to install Mongoose. That's the ORM for MongoDB. What else do we need? I'm trying to think. Connect Mongo for the session store. And I think that should be it for now. We are going to need the Stripe API libraries, but we'll worry about that stuff later. Okay, so I think this should be, let's install .env as well. Okay, that should be fine. So let's go ahead and create a new folder. Let's call it source, and we will create an index.js file. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and import Express. So Express, and we'll create the app just like that. We'll call the Express function. We're also going to need to set up a port, so I'm going to do that inside the .env file. So we'll set the port equal to 3001. So now if I want to reference that environment variable, I can just simply reference process.env.port. In case if that environment variable is not available, I'll just manually set it to 3001. Sometimes it might not be available because if you're deploying to Heroku, for example, or sometimes I think Amazon EC2, I think it might not give you that port. But I think with EC2 and Amazon Web Services, it should be fine. But I know Heroku, they give you a dynamic port. So we'll listen to port 3002. So we'll start listening to requests and just log a message. All right, great. So now this should work. If you are to run this app, it should work just fine. I'm going to go ahead and set up a simple dev script with Nodemon. So if you don't have Nodemon, I recommend you install it. It's very easy to install. Just do npm-i-g Nodemon. It basically will speed up development for you. Instead of having to manually restart your app, it will just do it automatically whenever you make a change to it. So we'll just do Nodemon source. Okay, so this will pretty much run this index.js. I don't need to specify index.js because by default, it will just run index.js if there's no file that was specified. So, but I'll just leave it like that for now. Okay, so let's run it. And let's see what happens. Always want to test our code just to make sure it works. Perfect. All right, great. It works just fine. All right, so now let's go ahead and opt into our middlewares because we need to make sure that we have certain middlewares in order for our app to function. Okay, so what exactly is middleware? Well, middleware is basically just you can think of it like a small piece of a function that will alter the request. It will do something with the request before it reaches the final request and response handler function. So for example, if we were to set up a simple route right now, let's just do app.gets res. Okay, this function over here is known as the handler function, and that's what handles the request, so we can send a response back if we want to. But sometimes we might need to do things right before we reach the actual handler function. Okay, now instead of just writing all the code inside this handler function, what we want to do is we want to write more modular code, and that's why middleware exists, because we can pretty much just inject that middleware anywhere we want in our application, and it will work just fine. Okay, so the middlewares that we'll need to opt into, let's opt into the first one, which is going to be for serializing requests whenever we make them. So this is very important because by default, Express will not serialize any payloads for you. So for example, if you make a post request, like let's say you try to send a request body that has the username and password. If you don't actually opt into the middleware, it's going to have that object as an empty object. And I'll show you an example when we set up the application with Postman. So let's go ahead and reference app.use, and we're going to reference express.json. So this is going to serialize the, well, not really serialize, but you can think of it as parsing. It's going to take in the payload, it's going to parse into JSON, and it's going to attach it to the request body object. So this is for sending JSON to the server. Now, if you're sending URL encoded form data, which is basically whenever you go in the HTML form and you click on submit, right, it's going to send that payload as URL encoded, so you need to make sure you handle that. So we'll do that by simply doing express.url encoded, and we'll set extended to false. I think if you set extended to true, that allows you to send objects in the query string, I think. I'm not entirely sure because I never really looked super into it, but I remember looking it up on Stack Overflow one time. That's what they said. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's set up a simple post request, and we're gonna open up Postman. Okay, so I'm gonna just simply console log rec.body, and I'll show you what happens. So let me open up Postman. All right, so we're gonna test our API right now with Postman. So I recommend you guys download it. It's free. But we're going to make a post request, so let's select post. You can see that they have a bunch of different HTTP verbs that you can go through. We're going to go ahead and do port 3001. Just type in the URL. So we're going to make a post request, and let's send a request body. So let's send raw, and let's select JSON, and we'll do hello world. So remember, we have it as JSON. You can set it as text or raw or actual HTML if you want, but make sure you have JSON though. So let's send. You can see that we actually have the object over here. Now if I go ahead and if I get rid of express.json, you're going to see that it's going to be empty. Okay, now the reason why is, like I said, because we don't have the middleware. Now let's try URL encoded right now, and let's just send hello world. So we're sending URL encoded. So remember, this is the HTML form. And you can see that it says hello world. But if I get rid of that middleware, and if I send it again, you're going to see that it's empty. So that's why these middlewares are very important. I just thought I'd go over it real quick because a lot of people tend to not really understand these middlewares. Okay, but they're very important. And you want to make sure you register your middlewares before you have any of your routes being set up, because if you have these middlewares like right over here, it's not going to work. So just make sure you have it up there, because again, the middlewares are basically registered in order. So if you were to have it underneath over here, it wouldn't affect any of these routes. It wouldn't even work at all. Okay, but hopefully that makes sense. All right, so the next middleware that we're going to set up is Express Session. So express sessions are going to allow us to persist our application. So it's very important because we don't want the user to have to authenticate over and over again. And we want to be able to identify every request and who is making that request, especially when we have an application that requires authentication. So sessions allow us to do things like that. So we're going to go ahead and simply just clear this, install express session. Okay, I think I did install it already. Actually, I think I did install it. But just in case you guys missed it, make sure you install it again. Express-session, and we're gonna import it up here. So const session equals require session express session, and what we'll do is we will simply register the middleware right over here. So let me leave a comment over here, registering middleware for parsing request bodies, and we'll do registering session middleware. Okay, so we're going to use the app.use function, and the session over here, this variable, this is actually a function, so we can pass in an options, and we're going to pass in cookie value, which is an object. And for this, we're going to need to pass in the max age. So this specifies how long the session or the cookie should live for. So we'll probably do just 1 day. So we'll do 3,600,000 times 24. Okay, that should be pretty much it. You can also set other values too. So if you want secure, signed, the same site, etc. But I'll leave you guys to worry about that. We don't need to worry about those things, at least right now. I'm just going to worry about the minimum things for development. Let's go ahead and set save uninitialized to false. So this will allow the session to only be saved if the session object has been modified. Because if you have this set to true, it's going to save the session every single time, even if the user has not logged in or registered, and you don't want that. We'll set resave to false as well. This will prevent the session from being resaved. Okay, and we will also, I think the secret is next. So this is going to be some random string that you need to set in order to actually encrypt the cookie. You want to make sure you keep this secret, because if an attacker gets a hold of that secret, they can decrypt the cookie, and they can actually do a bunch of terrible things. So just make sure you keep the secret. So for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to place this inside a string over here. You could put this inside a .env file if you want, but I'll just leave it right over there. Okay, and I think that is it for the session. Okay, now before we continue, I'm going to briefly show you guys how it works, so that way when we actually get to the authentication part, everything will really make sense. Okay, I really want you guys to understand all of this, so I'm taking the time to explain everything. Let's go over to let's get rid of this post because we're not going to need it anymore. Let's create this, let's go inside this get request, the handler, and let's go ahead and do if session, or not session, if rec.session. Okay, so you can see that we actually have this property session on the request object, and we're going to check to see if rec.session.authenticated. So right now, this session object will not have the authenticated object, okay? Or I'm sorry, not authenticated object, the authenticated property. But what we're going to do is, if it is there, that means they've already visited the actual page. Okay, that means they've already, they visited us, they've logged in, etc. If they have not visited us yet, they would not have this authenticated property on the session object. And therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to attach it, and we'll just simply say authenticated, and we'll just do something like, let's just do username hello, something like this, something simple. Okay, and we will just simply say res.send, and let's just do status 200, and then we'll do session rec.session ID rec.session ID. Okay, now if they're authenticated, we'll just do the same thing, but you're going to see there's going to be a difference. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out. So what I'm going to do is make sure we're running our app. We're going to go into Postman and let's make a GET request. So let's make a GET. So you can see right now that we are not authenticated, but now we are. Right? What happened was that we basically went into this request. It said, hey, look, if rec.session authenticated, it's going to send this. Actually, you know what? Let me actually console log something. User already authenticated. So you guys can actually see the logs. Console log, user visited for the first time. Okay, so I'm going to save. And because we aren't using session stores, the sessions are going to be wiped. They're currently saved in memory, but we're going to need to save it into a database later. So if I run, and you can see that it says user visited for the first time, if I send it again, you're going to see that it says user already authenticated. Okay, see how that works? So now you can see that right now, every single time I make a request, this session ID belongs to us. This is our unique session ID. So every single time the user makes a request, I know who they are because of this session ID. On the front end, on the client, this session ID is saved as a cookie. Okay? Now let me show you one more thing real quick. Instead of I'm going to go and just get rid of this condition. So we're not going to modify the session. And I want you guys to see what happens. So you can see we have our session. Okay? You can see we have our session ID. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. If I send, you're going to see that we have a different ID every single time. Okay? And that's fine because we're not authenticated. But when you're authenticated, you want to make sure that session ID does not change, because how do you know which user is which? You're going to have a bunch of different session IDs that correspond to one user, and that's not good. Okay? So this is normal behavior because we have not yet authenticated. But when we authenticate, the libraries that we're going to use, such as Passport.js, is going to handle that by modifying the session for us. It's going to serialize the user to the session, and it's going to say, hey, look, the user just logged in. They're good to go. So hopefully that part makes sense. And that's going to be pretty much it for the session part. So now that we have gone over the sessions, and we've gone over the middleware for parsing request bodies, the next thing that we're going to need to worry about is the actual authentication part. So that's basically going to be logging in and then saving it to the database. So in the next part of this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set up the routes for authentication. All right, so we're going to go ahead and set up authentication for our application, or the routes rather. So we're going to go over to the source folder. We'll click on new folder and create a new routes folder. And I'll just create an index.js file. Almost did index.ts for a second, index.js. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and simply set up a router. So const, I'm going to import the router, just like that. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and simply set up the router by just invoking that function. And the router pretty much works the same way as the regular app over here. Let me close this so you guys can see the whole thing. Okay, so I can do things like router.get. I can even register middleware on the router too, so that middleware will only be registered for that set of routes itself. But the reason why we're using a router is because we don't want to keep all of our requests or all of our routes in just one file. We're going to split everything up, and that's why we're going to use routers. So what I'm going to do with this router is I'm actually going to go ahead and set up this architecture where we're going to create a new router. And for this, I'm going to call this auth. So this is going to be auth router. And we're going to copy and paste the same code again. Okay. So this auth router is basically going to have all of the auth routes. So for example, and I'll show you guys this in just a sec, just send a simple message, auth route status 200. Okay. And we want to make sure we export this. So module export equals router. So now this index.js is this index.js that is inside the routes directory. it's not inside auth, it's inside routes. So there's two. I know the naming is a little bit weird, but personally for me, I prefer naming it index.js inside the folder itself. You don't have to do this, but you can if you want to. So inside this index.js, okay, source routes index.js, this is going to be the main file. Usually you can call this a barrel file. That's what they call a barrel file. We're going to take this router and we're going to register all of these subroutes. Okay, so first let's import auth routes. We're going to import this from auth, and we're going to do router.use, and we're going to register the auth route with all of these other routes over here. Okay, so basically what we're doing is we're saying, hey, look, we're going to import this router, okay, and this router is going to be registered. All the routes are going to be prefixed with the /auth. Okay, now we need to export this, and don't worry, I'm going to show you guys how this works. So we're going to export this, and inside the app.js or index.js, goddamn, there's so many index.js files, but inside the main index.js, you know what, let me actually name this to app.js. Normally I name it as app.js because it's getting really confusing. I don't want to make this so complicated for you guys. Actually, you know what I'll do? Scratch that. Let me go ahead. Let me just do this. I don't want to make it complicated for you guys, so I'll make it simple. Because normally I do this and I like it, but I don't want to make it super complex. Okay, so I renamed it from index.js to auth.js, and I got rid of the auth folder. Okay. All right. So now in app.js, what we want to do is we want to import our routes. So const routes equals require. Now we want to import the router, but which one do we want to import? Do we want to import auth.js or index.js? Well, index.js is going to be the main router that we're going to register all our routes in. So you want to make sure you import index.js. Okay, so that's /routes index. Okay, but since it's index, we can just do /routes. Okay, and then we will register all those routes right before, or sorry, not right before, right after we register all of our middleware. So app.use, and now for our main route, we're going to prefix it with /API routes. Okay, so by default, we have no router, but what we're going to do is we're going to register all of the routes for this router, and that router is going to be this right over here. So every route over here is going to be prefixed with /API. Now inside this router, we're saying, hey, look, every route, despite it being prefixed with /API, we're going to take the other routers and we're going to prefix it with /auth as well. So basically it creates a prefix of /API/auth. I know it's a little bit tricky, but we're going to go ahead and test this out so you guys can understand how it works. So let's go ahead and let's visit /API/auth. Oh, we need to run. There we go. Let's try it again. And you can see we have the auth route. Okay, notice how it's prefixed with /API. If we try to do /auth, it's going to say cannot get. If I try to do /API, cannot get. Well, /API would be, if you wanted to set up a route for /API, you could do that inside here because that's what is being prefixed over here. So for example, you want to do router.gets, and let's say you're doing v1, for example. We'll just do v1. We'll do v1. There you go. But we're not going to worry about that. Okay, but you can hopefully that makes sense. You can see that we have all these routes are registered with this /auth prefix, and then all of these routes are being registered right over here with the /API. So if I were to create another router, and that router would be something like for payments, and we are going to be doing this later, so might as well do it now. I'm just going to copy and paste everything. Okay, and we'll call this payments route. And then over here, we will simply register /payments with payments routes. And we need to import it, so we'll do that. Okay, and now if I try to reference payments, you can see we have payments route. Notice how in the actual router itself, we aren't doing /payments or /auth. That's because if we did that, you'll notice that it's going to say cannot get, but we have to reference /payments/payments. Okay, so this slash over here is basically the root of payment. It's the beginning of payments. Okay, so just letting you guys know that. Hopefully this makes sense. Okay, but yeah, so that's going to be pretty much the architecture for our routing. So let's go ahead and just close all of this. Okay, so we have our auth routes. So let's just set up all the routes that we're going to need. So we are going to be using Discord Oauth 2, but you can really use whatever it is that you want. It doesn't really matter. You can use Google, you can use Facebook, Twitter. The important thing is that you're using some provider that gives you access to the email address, okay? It doesn't matter what you're using, or just make sure you have the email address, because the email address is going to be the only piece of information that we need that's unique that we can use to identify the customer. So I'm going to set up a couple routes. So for auth, I'll do auth/status. So this is going to allow us to check to see if the user is authenticated. I'll leave this empty for now. Actually, I'll just send a 200. We need routes where the user are going to visit to actually log in. So we're going to set up, let's do auth/Discord. And then res. Okay, and then we're also going to set up another route for the redirect. So right now we just have a bunch of routes, but don't worry, in the next section of this video, I'm going to explain how the Oauth 2 is going to work, so you guys understand what's going on. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and just briefly explain the Oauth 2 flow for those who aren't too familiar with it. Basically, instead of having a local username and password where the user can authenticate, what you want to do instead, or you don't have to, but you can, and I feel like Oauth 2 is actually a lot more secure because you don't really need the user to use a password. You don't have to worry about hashing the password, but it also makes your app dependent on another service. But basically with Oauth 2, the user clicks on some kind of button and it visits the route. It will navigate them to the route, okay? And that route is going to be this route over here, this /Discord. Well, it's actually going to be, let me just leave a comment. It's going to be /API/auth/Discord. When they visit that route, this route is going to give them that screen, right? That little splash screen where they can see the authorize button, okay, and they can click authorize, and it'll also tell them what permissions, what scopes that the application has access to. So for example, they can either see your email address, they can see your username, your guilds, etc. Okay, so you want to make sure that you set up this route. Okay, that's going to be for this route. Now, once you authorize, what happens is there's what's called a callback URL. Now, that callback URL is basically the URL that the application, whether it's Discord, Google, Facebook, that third-party application is going to redirect the user who's authenticating to that redirect URL. Now, that redirect URL is going to be this route over here. Okay, it could be any route, but you want to make sure that it redirects to your route because it'll give you the code. It'll give you a code parameter, and that parameter is what's used to exchange the access and refresh token. And you can use that to retrieve the user details, their email address, guilds, etc. Okay, so that's pretty much just how things work underneath the hood. But with Passport, you kind of need to worry about something different. So we'll talk about that right now. Okay, so let's go ahead and first install Passport. So we're going to install Passport, and then you want to install the strategy. So the strategy can either be whether it's Google, Discord, etc. So if you want to use Discord, you'd have to install Passport Discord. If you want to use Google, you can install Passport Google Oauth 2 or Oauth 20. Sorry, Oauth. It's basically Oauth 2.0, but it can't have the dot in between the 2 and 0. So it's Passport-Google-Oauth 2.0. Okay. They have a bunch of different passports. You can actually go on Passport's website. let me actually, and you can actually look at all of the different passports. Facebook, Twitter, Google are the most common ones. If you want to do Facebook, you do passport Facebook, okay? But they have a lot of different strategies that you can use. You can even implement your own, okay? They have a whole bunch, okay? But we'll just install these two for now. So let's install it. And there we go. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go into our app.js and we're going to register the passport middleware. But first we need to import passport. So I'll import it right up here. So const passport equals require passport. Okay. And we're not going to import passport Discord in here. We're going to go ahead and simply do app.use passport.initialize. That initializes passport. And then we want to set up sessions with passport as well. So we'll do that. And there you go. That's all you have to do. Okay. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to set up our strategy. So we're going to create a new folder and I'm just going to call this strategies because you might have multiple different strategies. But I'll just set up a Discord strategy. So I'll just do discord.js. That's the name of the file, not the Discord bot library. And that was not intentional. But we're going to go over here and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and import the strategy file or the strategy class. So passport-discord, there's a strategy right over here. Okay, I think that should be it. Yeah, strategy. You can just hit the dot over here and you can see all the different classes and functions that they have, but it seems like they only have like I think a few classes. Okay. All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna import passport in this strategy file, and let me actually move this down over here. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're going to reference passport.use, and then we're gonna go ahead and create an instance of this strategy. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and do new strategy, and you're gonna see that in the constructor, it's going to take in an options object. And inside this options object, this is where you want to pass in your credentials. So you're going to always have a client ID, a client secret, callback URL, and scopes. So you can see client ID, there's client secret, where is callback URL, and then scope. Scopes is usually an array. Now, what you pass in to these properties, these values, right, is basically going to generate the URL that's going to redirect you to. Okay, but we're going to worry about that in just a sec. Okay, I'm going to show you guys how to actually get those values for Discord. Okay, but the second parameter is going to be a function. Now this function is going to be a callback function, and it's going to take in 4 parameters. It's going to take in the access token, the refresh token, the profile, so that's the user details, and then a callback function. Okay, and that is pretty much it, I think. Yeah, there's no other parameter that we can pass in. Okay, awesome. Let me go ahead and just move this over here a little bit. Okay. All right, so now basically what's going to happen is whenever we visit the authorization URL or authentication URL, it's basically going to invoke this strategy, or should invoke the strategy. Okay, and once we click authorize, it's going to give us the access token, the refresh token, the profile, and then we're going to need to call the done callback once we're actually done. Now, what's important about this function is that this function itself is basically where we're going to take care of checking to see if the user is in the database. If they are in the database, we're going to go ahead and return that user object so that it can be serialized into the session. If the user is not found in the database, then what we want to do is we want to create the user, and then we're going to save the user to the database, and then we're going to return that user so that it can be serialized. Okay, so what we're going to do is, let me actually go ahead and do this. Let me just simply console log the profile object. And you can see that this profile has a bunch of different properties. Okay, and again, we're using the Discord strategy. So we'll just save that real quick. And I think what I'll do next is I'll show you guys how to bring in the strategy. So we want to make sure we import that strategy. So we can go ahead and just do something like require strategies Discord. We don't really need to store this inside a variable, so we can just use the require. It'll basically just bring in this function, you know, right over here. I mean, ideally you could do everything outside over here, but you don't want to, like, you know, put everything in one file. So it's just better to just create a separate file for it and then just import it. Okay, I'll just leave it all the way up here since it's a require. Okay. I actually also forgot to use .env. So let's do that real quick. Because right now this environment variable actually was undefined because I didn't actually invoke the .env config function. So make sure you do that. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and grab our credentials. We're going to grab the client ID, client secret, the callback URL, and then we're going to specify the scope. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Okay, now since we are using Discord, we obviously want to go to discord.com and grab it. But if you're using, let's say, Twitter, Google, right, just go over to their developer console, and they usually have instructions on how you can get those credentials. If you are having trouble with it, just simply Google how to find those things. They usually have a bunch of articles that explain how to find those details. But ideally, you just want to make sure you look for Oauth 2 credentials. So you can go ahead and create a new application. I'll create a new application. I'll call this Stripe integration. I'll click create. And there you go. We have a new application. And you can see we have our client ID. Let me zoom in a little bit. We have our client ID. We have our client secret. And we have the public key. Okay. So the client secret, you need to make sure you keep this a secret. The client ID is okay. That's public. And since we're not working with a bot, at least not right now, we will be using the bot later. But since we're not using the bot right now, we're not going to worry about the token. You can see right over here that we haven't added the bot yet. But we're going to copy the ID, and let me go ahead and place that right over here. So I'll just do Discord client ID, and I'll set that over here. And if you accidentally reveal a secret, you can always regenerate it. So let's just copy that. Discord client secret. And I think the last thing we need is the redirect URL. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a redirect URL. So this is going to differ based on which environment you're in. What I mean by that is right now we're currently in development, but if you were to deploy your app, you'd want to also provide your domain as well. Luckily with Discord, we can actually add multiple redirects, which is great. So we'll do that. So what is our redirect URL? Well, if we look at our auth.js, you can see that this over here is the redirect. Okay, so we want to basically make sure we have everything right over here with our host name. So our host name is going to be HTTP localhost, the port 3001, and then /API/auth/discord/redirect. If you get an error, something like redirect URI is invalid, double check this redirect URL and double check your routes. Okay, but this should be fine. And we can also add another one if we want. So if I had like a domain name, I can place that over there. If we have time, I'll probably show you guys how to deploy this as well. But let's go ahead and we can also select the scopes. So, but I think actually we don't need to worry about that. Let me actually see. Okay, well, so actually you can actually generate the URI yourself, but the library is going to do that for us. Okay, so we don't need to necessarily, see, you can see how it generates this URL. Basically, this is the URL the library is going to generate for us. It's going to basically visit it for us. You can even go to the URL right now if you want to and see what happens. Okay, but let's go ahead and save, and I think we are good. But let's also copy the routes for the callback URI. And I think you can actually just get away with passing in the route itself. You don't need to actually pass in the host. You can if you want to, but I'm just going to leave it like that. This should work just fine. Okay, and like I said, if you're using Google Oauth, if you're using Twitter Oauth, LinkedIn, GitHub, it all works the same exact way. The ID, the secret, callback URL, it all works the same way. It's the standard, okay? All right, so now we can actually go inside our strategy file, and we can actually reference our environment variables. So process.env, Discord client ID, Discord client secret, process.env, Discord callback URL. Now you also need to make sure that your config, your .env file has been invoked. So I forgot to do it earlier, but I did it already. Because if you don't, your environment variables are going to be undefined. And you also want to make sure you do it right before you import your strategy. So right now, if you actually, let me actually console log this right now. Right now, it's actually going to be undefined. So if I run this, you'll see that's going to be undefined. Yep, you can see it threw an error, undefined. Okay, the reason why is because we called the function after we imported this middleware. Remember, middleware is registered in order. Okay, so it's basically trying to invoke this function, but since there's no value for the client ID or the secret or the callback URL, it's going to throw an error. So you should put this all up here, and there you go. Okay, very, very, very simple. So now that we actually have all of our credentials, let's set the scope. The scope that we want is we want email and profile. Now with different providers like Google, they have different scopes, but I think with Google, it's just email, I think, and there's also profile as well. I think with Google, I think is actually, sorry, with Discord, I think it's identify and email. I think with Google, it's profile and an email. I'm not entirely sure, but like I said, you can always just Google it. Okay, but yeah, we want to make sure you specify the scopes. Okay, and let's go ahead and let's try to test this out. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and try to test this out. So we're gonna try to visit /API/auth/Discord. So /API/auth/Discord. Now you're gonna see nothing's gonna happen. It's actually going to stay loading for an indefinite amount of time. The reason why is because we need to actually invoke the passport.authenticate method. Okay, so to do that, we need to go into our route, auth.js right over here. Okay, and we need to go ahead and for the base route Discord, we need to, well, first let's import passport. So let's go and do const passport equals require passport. And right over here, in between the route name and the handler function, we're going to pass in the middleware. Okay, so passport.authenticate. And we're going to go ahead and pass in the name of the strategy, which is Discord. Okay, and you want to make sure you do the same thing for the redirect URL. All right, perfect. If we have time, I'll explain how things work underneath the hood. But let's just go ahead and leave it like this for now. And we can get rid of this handler because we're not going to need that. Okay, and inside the redirect, for the redirect, we do need it. So we'll just send a 200. All right, so now you can see now we actually have this page. So if I go back here, let's go back to /API/auth/Discord. You can see we have our Stripe integration. We have our username and avatar, the email address, etc. And we can click authorize. Now when I click authorize, let's see what happens. Let's go to the console. And now you can see that we have this object. Now what exactly is this object? Well, if you go over to here, you can see that we're logging it right over here. Now you'll notice that nothing is going to happen. It's going to keep on loading. It's normal right now because we haven't actually implemented the validation for our user. We need to handle it by checking to see if the user exists, saving it if it doesn't, and then returning it once we're done. But you can see we have a bunch of different fields. We have our ID, the username, avatar, discriminator, the email address, okay, a bunch of different things. And like I said, if you're using Google, if you're using Twitter, Facebook, it might not look exactly the same, but you'll definitely have a lot of similar properties, such as the email address, okay? So I would encourage you to use your own strategy, like use Google if you want, and then get the email, and then save it to the database. So the next part of this tutorial, we're going to go ahead and focus on saving the user to the database, while also making sure that the user has not been saved to the database already. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on that. Alright, so what we need to do is we need to get started on implementing the database part of this application. So we're going to go over to source, we're going to right click and create a new folder, and I'll call this database. And I'll create a new file, and actually I'll create a new folder called models. And remember, we're using MongoDB. So I'm going to create a user.js, and then we're going to create a customer later. Or we can just probably keep everything inside user.js, to be honest with you, because we're not really using relational database. So I think we'll just use one model for now. Okay, so let's model this out. So let's first import Mongoose from Mongoose, and let's create the schema. So user schema equals new Mongoose dot schema, and we'll create the schema definition. So what are we going to need? We'll need the email. This is going to be a string, so type will be a string. I don't think I can do string here, but I think I could. I think it should be fine. Required true, unique true, because we don't want multiple emails in our schema. Let's see, we'll get the Discord ID, that's important. And we will also do that as well. I think actually, let me actually get rid of that for now. We'll just leave it like this. We'll get rid of the unique just for now. Let's see, email, Discord ID. I think that should be it. Later we'll create the customer schema, and then we'll attach it to this. But I think this should be okay. I think that's really all we need. You can add other fields, obviously, if you want, but this is probably all we'll need for now. Okay. Yeah, this is fine. So what we're going to do next is we're going to compile the schema down to a model. So we're going to do mongoose.model user and pass in the user schema. And there we go. Okay, so let's work on the customer one right now. So customer schema. Now this customer one is going to be part of the user schema. So for example, we're going to have a customer, and type is going to be customer schema, like that. Okay, now it's not going to be required. So I think default we can set it to null. Now for customer, we're going to need a couple things. We're going to need, let's see, we'll need the Stripe ID. So in case if you forgot, the Stripe ID is provided to us whenever we create the customer from the Stripe API. Okay, so that's going to be required. So type string required true. Let me actually set this to false. We're going to need the Stripe ID. We're going to need the, I guess, subscription. So the user could probably have, I guess it's up to you on how you want to implement it, if you want them to be able to subscribe to more than one. Or you can also do things like upgrading subscriptions. We'll do subscription ID. So this will be string, and required will be false. Because they don't necessarily need to have a subscription even though they are registered as a customer. What else do I want? Subscribed dates. We can also just look at the the data that's returned from the Stripe API, and we can, see how it works. Okay, but I think for now we'll leave it like this. So this should be okay. This user schema has a customer schema, so that should be just fine. Hopefully it should be fine. I haven't used Mongoose for a while, so I'm kind of just like winging it, but I know it should be okay. I'm pretty confident. All right, so now we need to import the Mongoose library. We need to connect to Mongoose. So let's do const mongoose equals require mongoose. And we'll probably just, honestly, I'll just connect to it over here. Connect. And we'll need the MongoDB URI. Alright, so I'm going to store the MongoDB URI in my environment variable. So MongoDB URI. If you're using something like MongoDB Atlas, you'll just copy the URI they gave you and place it over here. But it's going to be MongoDB and then localhost. And then by default, it's on port 27017. And then we'll do stripe app. Name it whatever you want. That's the database name. My local database does not have authentication, so I'm not going to worry about that. Okay, but like I said, if you're using MongoDB Atlas, just paste in the URI. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and reference the MongoDB URI. And then we will simply just say .then. And I'm not sure if it resolves a value, but I'll just console log connected to MongoDB. And you need to make sure that if you're using MongoDB, that you actually have it installed. So please make sure you actually go on YouTube or Google and look up how to install MongoDB. Otherwise, you're going to get a connection issue. So please make sure you do that. Okay, so I have MongoDB installed already, so you can see that it connected just fine. It's giving me a couple of warnings, so we can address those right now. So use new URL parser, true. Use unified topology, true. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Connected to MongoDB. All right, awesome. Okay, and let me go ahead and let me try to connect to my MongoDB. There we go. So you can see we're connected to our MongoDB database. Okay, so that's fine. So our database has not been created yet because we haven't saved anything, but it will be created once we actually start saving stuff. Okay, so now I think that should be fine. We'll set up the session store towards the very end, because that's not really important right now. Okay, so what's important is we save everything to the database. So we're going to go ahead and let's import the user. So we're going to go to database, models, user. And I think I had imported as an export default, so no curly braces, no destructuring that. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to get the profile. So let's see, we want the email address. So let me minimize this. Let me open this up on the side so I can see what fields I need. So we need the email, ID, and then I think that should be fine. If you want, you can save the access token. Basically, you can use the access token to call the Discord API to do things such as getting the users' roles. You can get their guilds and etc. We'll probably worry about that later, but I'm going to go ahead and simply just save these two for now. And we're going to go ahead and just say const new user, or actually wait, sorry about that. We need to check to see if the user exists. So we want to search the user by, I guess we can search by email. Yeah, we can search by email. Notice how I'm not saving the guilds though. The reason why you don't want to save the guild to the database is because that data can actually be stale data. Basically, if the user leaves the guild, the database will not auto-update. Now, unless you manage that with your Discord bot, so whenever the user leaves the guild, you search the database and then you delete that record from that array. But I would probably encourage you guys to use the Discord API with the access token instead, which is why I said later I will focus on showing you guys how to do that. Okay, but we're going to worry about just saving the email and the ID. So we're going to first check to see if we can find the user, if there's a user that exists by that email. So we'll do const find user, or I'll call it user DB. And we're going to use async await. So I'm going to put the async keyword in front of this function. And we'll do await user.find one, pass in the criteria. And I want to see if I can find it by the ID, I guess. I can do both. So it's not like it's going to matter too much. Okay. So we'll find it by ID. So let me actually also wrap this inside a try catch as well. Okay, so if the user DB was not found, we're going to create the user. However, if the user was found, we are going to call this done function. That's a callback function. And this function takes in an error, user object, and info object. You can see there's 3 parameters. We're only going to worry about the 2. So if there's no error, then there will be no error that's thrown because we're using try catch. So the error will be null. And we want to pass in the user DB object right over here, just like that. However, if an error has been thrown, we're going to catch it down here, and then we'll return error and then null. So let me just double check just to make sure I passed in the parameters correctly. So it's error first and then the user. Okay, and in just a sec, I'll explain what this done function actually does. But for now, let's go ahead and actually create the user. So if the user is not found, then we're going to go ahead and create it. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a simple console log down here. We'll just say user was found. And then inside here, I'll say user was not found. User was not found creating. Okay. And to create the user with Mongoose, it's very, very easy. We'll simply do await user. We'll reference the model dot create, and then we'll pass in the fields. So ID and then email. Okay, and I'm actually just going to go ahead and do this just so it's on the same line. I don't think we need to save it. I'm not sure if we need to save it. I forgot. It's been a while, but I don't think we need to save it. We'll check it out in just a sec. Okay, but let's go and test this out. So let's just make sure our app is running. Let's see what's going on. Oh, it's giving us an issue because we have customer schema down here. I forgot that these things are not hoisted. So we have to put that up there. Okay, there we go. All right, so let's go ahead and test our app. So let's go over here. So let's go ahead and authorize. Let's see, Discord ID. Oh, did I accidentally... Oh, I forgot I named it. I think I named it Discord ID. That's right. Whoops, let me go ahead and fix that. Okay, but let me just go ahead and mention something real quick. You can see that we actually, it actually went into this if condition, and you can tell because it's saying that it was trying to this is an error that is used to, I think it's trying to create it. It's trying to create the actual thing, but you can see that we don't have the Discord ID property. We have ID, but don't worry, we'll fix that. Or you know what? I'm just gonna change it to ID. Just change the ID. Obviously, if you have multiple IDs, you would just name it, but I'll just use it as ID for now. Screw it. All right, let's try this again. So let's go over here. Let's authorize. So it says unauthorized. That's fine. Let's look at the console. So it says user was not found creating. And you can see earlier it said user was not found creating. So it gave us that error because we had the wrong property name. That's okay. Now you can see user was not found creating. So now you can see that it has this log user was found. Okay, so don't worry about that for now. So user was not found creating. We create the user. Now let's just double check our database just to make sure that it's been created. So I'm going to just use the shell. So let's just show DBs So we have our databases, so use stripe app, check tables, db.users.find, pretty. Okay, so it seems like I don't need to call the save function. Usually if you were to create an instance, so if you were to create it like this, so new user, and then you were to pass in all the fields, I think you would need to call .save. But if you just use user.create, you're fine. Okay, so there you go. We have our record. Perfect, that's great. That's amazing. So what we're gonna do is, oh, I forgot to also return done. So there's no error. And we're gonna return new user. Okay, remember we're returning new user inside this if condition because the user DB was not found. Okay, the user was not found. So you don't want to return user DB in here. That's null. You want to return new user, the new user that was created. Okay, I'm just gonna delete these logs. Actually, I'll just leave it there for later in case we need it. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's re-authenticate. So now it says failed to serialize user into session. Okay, so this is happening because we don't have the passport.serialize and deserialize functions set up. So this next part, we're going to go ahead and set that up. Okay, so first of all, what exactly is serializing and deserializing when it comes to sessions? Well, serializing basically allows us to choose how we want to save the user to the session. So for example, usually with the sessions, you typically want to save any data that has to correspond to, any kind of activity the user is doing. So for example, if you have a checkout form or if you have some kind of a shopping cart, right, you could save it all on the front end, okay? But sometimes a lot of applications save it on the back end. And what happens is they get the cookie from the front end and that cookie is searched through the database. And once they find it, it will give them back all of the pieces of information that was corresponding to that particular session. So again, sessions, you can think of it as a way to persist the state of the request. So it allows us to keep track of what the user is doing. Now, we need to serialize every single request, or not serialize every single request, but we have to deserialize every request so we know who exactly is trying to make that request. Okay, so we'll set up two functions. So passport serialize user, and this is going to take in a callback function. It takes in two parameters. It takes in the user object, and it takes in done. Okay, and you can see that right over here, if I hover over it, you can see the done takes in an error, then the ID. Okay, all we're gonna do inside serialize user is we're just simply gonna go ahead and just call done. And we're going to pass in null because there's no error. And for the ID, so you can actually pass in the user ID right over here. So I'm going to pass in the user ID just like that. Okay, remember that ID is the name of the property for the user right over here. We changed it from Discord ID to ID. Okay, so that's just all we're going to do for serialize user. We're going to call deserialize user. This is going to take in the ID and then done. Okay, so notice how this serialize user takes in the user object, but this deserialize user takes in the ID. The truth is that whatever you actually pass into the second parameter for the done function inside serialize user, that is what's going to be taken in as a parameter in deserialize user. So it goes like this. So user.id, that gets passed into here. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, I can even console log too, and I'll add console logs just so that you guys can keep track of what's going on. So serializing user, and then we'll log the user, and then we'll say deserializing user, and we'll say deserializing user, and then we'll just console log the ID. So inside deserialize user, what this is responsible for is it's basically responsible for searching the database. So what this deserialize user function is responsible for is it's responsible for searching the database to see if the user is found. Okay, the reason why we saw the fail to deserialize user or serialize user into session is because we didn't have the actual functions, right? But this function is used for searching the database to see if we can associate this ID that we were given with any user in the database. Okay, so if the user is not found in the database, it's going to return null, which means that that user does not exist. There's no session to be created. If the user is found, okay, that means we're going to be able to return it back. And what happens is it actually attaches that user object to the request object. And what actually happens is it attaches that user object to the request object. And I'll show you guys that in just a second. But let's go ahead and first let's actually make this an async function. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and say const user db await user find one, pass in the ID. And we're going to use ternary operator. So if user db is truthy, then we'll return done. There's no error. User db. And we're going to return the null and null. Now I'm going to go ahead and just wrap this in a try catch. So if there is an error, we'll just console log it. And then we'll return done, error, null. Okay, so let's go ahead and just look at what's happening. And then I'll explain it again so you guys get a better understanding. So we're going to authorize, and now it says OK. So let's look through the logs and let's see what happened. And then we'll look at our database to see what actually happened as well in the database part. So it says user was found, we serialize the user, okay? And you can see right over here that we logged the user over here. Now it didn't call deserialize user yet because this function is only for subsequent requests. So if we were to visit any one of our routes for our API, it's going to basically use this function every single time to check to see if that user, if that session is good, if that session corresponds with that user, and if it does, it's going to attach the user object to the request object. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's see. Let me go into the database. Let me see if any sessions were created. Nope. Okay, so no sessions were created in the database because we aren't using a database store, or a session store rather. Okay, so right now if I were to restart the server, nothing would work, okay, because we don't have a session store. So let me actually show you guys something real quick. So let me go into status. So I haven't restarted the server yet, but let me go to status. And you can see it says OK. And if I go to the logs, you're going to see this is deserializing user now, okay? And if you look over here, that's coming from over here, and it's logging the ID. And because the user is able to be found, we are good. Okay, now if I restart the server right now, I'm going to restart it. I'm going to go to visit, and nothing changes because we didn't implement anything, but you can see that it's not even deserializing the user because we aren't even saving any of these sessions to the database. Okay, so basically the session only works right now as the app is running, but if the app restarts, then all of the sessions are gone. And you don't want that because, you know, that would probably be bad for the user. So instead what we'd rather do is, because let's say for example, right? Let's just say for example, if your server crashes and the user is doing something, okay, well, all of their data is gone, like their current session is gone if they're playing a game or if they're, you know, shopping for something. Let's say they have like 500 items. Do you really want them to have to add everything all over again? No, right? You want to make the experience for the user as the greatest as possible, like the best possible that you can possibly make it. So let's go ahead and focus on implementing the session store. And once we're done with the session store, that should be pretty much it for the authentication part. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to the auth.js file. And instead of sending this 200 request, why don't we send the actual user? So I'm going to go ahead and send the user. And I'll send the session ID as well. Okay. And why don't we also, let me see, can I actually reference the deserialized user or the session ID here? I don't think I can. but that's fine. So why don't we do this? Let's go over to status right now. You'll see that right now we're not logged in and it's not giving us the user back. But why don't we go ahead and log in? Let's click authorize and let's go over to status. And you'll see right now we are logged in. Okay? Our sessions are currently saved in memory by default. If I refresh, you can see that I have the session ID. And basically I can use the app, but if the server goes down and if it goes back up, my session has been gone because it's saved in memory. Okay, so what we're going to do in this part of the series or the video tutorial is we're going to go ahead and implement the session store, and we're going to be using MongoDB. Okay, so session stores, you can pretty much use whatever session store you want. Literally all it is just a table in a database or a document in a database. It's really nothing complicated, really. Like, don't overthink it. All it is really just a place to store your session IDs. Okay, so you can save it in Redis, you can save it in MySQL, MongoDB, you can save it in PostgreSQL, whatever database you want. Now, typically what I like to do is I like to use MySQL, and I usually save the sessions in Redis because I think it's a lot better to save in Redis because Redis is pretty fast, and it makes sense to use sessions for that because Redis, you can also set a time to live for that session ID. So after, let's say, 60 seconds, it will expire and the session is pretty much done. In a database, you have to be responsible for making sure that it's clearing sessions periodically, sessions that are outdated, okay? But we're not going to overcomplicate it. Let's just use MongoDB. So earlier I installed a package called Connect Mongo, so make sure you install that, npm I connect-mongo. And we're going to go ahead and just import that right over here. So I'll probably just call this const connect mongo. Or actually, I think I'll call it store. And right over here, we're going to go ahead and do const mongo store. Actually, let me call this session store. And we're going to do const mongo store. And we're going to call session store. We're going to pass in the session right over here. So that's this right over here. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to reuse the same Mongoose connection or MongoDB connection. You can do that if you're using Mongoose. So we're going to go ahead and simply do store and then new Mongo store. And then for the connection, Mongoose connection, we're going to reference mongoose.connection. So notice how everything is in a specific order. So we're connecting first and then we are registering the middleware. Okay, so this should do the trick. And now if we go ahead and let's refresh right now. So let's go ahead and re-authenticate right now. Okay, so we're good. And now you can see that the user was found. Let's go ahead and look inside our database to see if we have the session table, and there you go, we have it. So if we go ahead and do db.sessions.find.pretty, you can see that we just have an object and it has this session property, and this session property has the cookie, it has the it has everything. It has the ID, it has the expires, so you can see that it expires in literally 1 day. This is in UTC time. I think it's a UTC string, date string, or whatever you call it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So you can see how over here we have this passport field, which has this user object and it has only the ID. The reason why the ID is over here and only the ID is because that's what we save to the database. You can save whatever you want. Okay, and let me show you one more thing. I'm going to open up my browser. I'm going to click on application. Let's go to cookies. You can see that right over here, let me zoom in. You can see we have this cookie, and this name is called connect.sid. And you can see this is how the cookie looks like. If I remember correctly, the cookie is, I think, in base64 format. I think sometimes you can tell as if there's this dot. So you can see everything after S% all the way up to this dot. That is the session ID. If you look at the database, let's see. Oh wait, I'm sorry, not the S%. It's S% 3A, and then you have the PL or PI, whatever. So you have the, yeah, that's an L, I think. So PL6V. So you can see it says PL6V, and it goes all the way to C. So if I want, I can copy this, and I can try to search for it. And let me see if I can search for it like this. I should be able to. There you go. I just searched for it. Okay, I just do one more thing. You can see that's empty, but yeah, we can also search for it as well. Okay, so this basically over here is the cookie that the browser or the client stores. Okay, so since we're using a web app, the browser is going to store this cookie. And what happens is this cookie can be used to validate all of our requests. If you were to clear this cookie, okay, I should have went to the status page first, but now you can see that it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't show our user. Let's log in again, and let's go ahead and authorize. And now let's go over to status, and there you go. We can see our cookie. If we go over to the database, you can see that we have another session. Okay, 54E4, 54EF. 54EF over here. Okay, so if I refresh, there you go. If I delete the session, so let me see if I can drop. I forgot how to do that. db.sessions not drop. If I refresh, you can see that I am no longer logged in because all the sessions were deleted from the database. Okay, even though we have the session, the cookie stored on the browser. Okay, but we can always, like I said, re-log in, and then it'll create a new session. All right, so that's pretty much going to be it for the whole authentication. We've pretty much already gotten everything pretty much good to go for authentication. Everything works the way it should. So I think for the rest of this tutorial, we can actually start working on the front end. And once we get the front end stuff going, we can start making requests to the back end, and then we can actually worry about the Stripe integration. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started on working on the front end part now.